If you are here simply because you want to know if I did it, if I completed the damn thing, then I am very happy to put you out of your misery and let you know that yes, I did complete my first year of the Art Fantasy bingo board. So a round of applause for me, please, because I did also have to use one of my swaps to be able to make it. So last year in April or May 2024, I posted my TBR for my first ever Art Fantasy Bingo challenge. This is a challenge that is posted on the fantasy section of Reddit every year, where you get a bingo board with 25 prompts, and in a 1-year time period, you are supposed to read a book to fulfill all of the prompts. There are some rules to this. You can only use one reread, so 24 of the 25 books you read have to be ones that you're reading for the first time. You cannot use an author more than once unless that author is also an author of one of the short stories you read for the prompts. And you also cannot double up on prompts, so every prompt has to be fulfilled by an individual book. There are two modes to this. There's regular mode and there's hard mode, with hard mode being obviously a little bit more difficult, like the parameters for the prompt being a little bit tighter. As this was my first year of the Art Fantasy bingo board, I just did like regular mode for all of the prompts, and if I did manage to fulfill it in hard mode, then that was just an accident. You are allowed to swap out one prompt on the board for a prompt that has been on a previous Art Fantasy bingo board, which I had to do because I did so well on this and there was just one prompt that I did not get to, and I'm mad about it for multiple reasons, but we'll talk about it when we get to that. So I am going to be talking a little bit about the TBR, the books that I intended to read to fulfill the prompts, and then the books that I actually read to fulfill the prompts. I'm not going to be going into too much detail about what the books are about and my like full thoughts on them, because there are 25 books here, and if you didn't know, like I just posted a 50 book recommendation video which took my entire life to film and edit, and I am not interested in having a repeat of that video. So we're just going to talk very briefly about them and how they fit the prompt. We are going to be going through the board as well, from top row left to right and then next row left to right all the way to the bottom. When I did my TBR, I filled it in with books that I was planning on reading very soon, books that are more on my yearly TBR, books for projects that I had going on or was thinking of doing. So when I built my TBR, it was a very cleverly curated selection of books. However, in typical Becca fashion, those are not the books that I actually read throughout the year. So the first book on the board is to read the first book in a series, and I actually had Way of Kings Part 1 by Brandon Sanderson in for this, which was also going to stand in as my only reread. I did intend to reread all of the Stormlight archives in preparation for book 5 to be released. However, I didn't do that. I did read Way of Kings Part 1, but it is not actually the book that I read for this challenge. The book that I actually read and counted for this prompt is 5 Broken Blades by Mike Holland. It just felt like it was not necessarily cheating, but I was like, why use a reread if I don't have to? So I swapped it out for 5 Broken Blades, which is the first book in a fantasy heist trilogy, following a bunch of 5 misfits and miscreants who have been assembled to kill the God King. So this was one that I'd heard very average reviews about. I listened to the audiobook. It's full cast audio, so if you do want to read this, would 100% recommend checking out the audiobook. And I just heard very average things about it, so I went into it with low expectations, but I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm hoping to get to the sequel sometime soon. The second prompt was to read a book with an alliterative title, so more than one word starting with the same letter. I struggled with this one a little bit, but the book that I put on my TBR and also the book that I read was Knock Knock Open Wide by Neil Sharpson. The thing that confused me about this is that I couldn't decide if it counted as alliterative if the words that start with the same letter are the same word. In this case, it was knock knock, but I think a couple of people told me that that was absolutely fine. This one was a book that I was reading for a book club. It was Jordaline's Patreon book club book, I think, and I was a guest for the month where she read this, and it is a horror about a woman who finds a body on the side of the road one night when she's driving home in a storm, and she puts it in the back of her car and like takes it to this farmhouse for help, and whatever happens in that house during like the 24 hours that she's in it, she never speaks about again. It is a horror that deals a lot with like Celtic mythology, and it was one that I really wanted to enjoy, but the more I thought about it, the more like weird plot holes and things that I wanted exploring in a little bit more details kind of showed up, and so it's not one that I enjoyed very much, sadly. Book number 3 was Under the Surface. So this one is a book where an important setting is underwater or underground. So the book that I had on my TBR and the book that I used to fulfill this prompt was Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. This one is the first book in a sci-fi trilogy that is told in mixed media about a young woman who, when she was a child, she was riding her bike and she fell into a hole and landed in this giant robot hand. So later in her life, she's actually asked to join this program. It's put together with like military personnel, scientists, and engineers who are excavating all of the parts of this giant robot that have been found around the world, trying to assemble it and then also figure out what its purpose is, who left it there, and why. So this is one that I also listened to in audiobook. Would definitely once again recommend the audiobook for this one. I'm pretty sure that in one of the books in this trilogy there is an underground research facility, maybe the second or the third one. I know that there is a military like research facility they're working in here, but I can't remember if that's underground. But the reason why I chose it for this prompt is because the hand is found underground, so it's important. Obviously it's the catalyst for the prompt, but I think I remember that when I read it I actually found out it was a lot more relevant to the prompt than I expected it to be. Prompt number 4 is criminals, and that is to read a book where a prominent character is a criminal, so an assassin, a thief, a murderer, something like that. And the hard mode for this is if it features a heist. So there are better books that I could have picked to achieve the hard mode, but as I said, that wasn't my aim going into it. And the book that I had on my TBR is indeed the one that I read for this prompt, which is Magic Study by Maria V. Snyder. This one is the second book in the Study series, which is part of a larger series called The Chronicles of Ixia, and it is following a woman called Yelena who is about to be executed because she murdered the son of a general. When she is on death row, she is pulled out and taken to the general commander, I think is the leader in this world, the commander's right hand, who is like his assassin and spy, and she's trained as a poison taster to taste the commander's food and see if there is poison, obviously to avoid an assassination. So this one kind of counts and kind of doesn't, because yes, she's a murderer, but did she murder for good reasons? I personally think so. So it was another one that like straddled the line a little bit, but I definitely think it counted enough to fulfill this prompt. It is not a book that I enjoyed though. I really liked the first book in this series. The second one I partially enjoyed. There were some things I didn't like, and the third book in this series, sadly, I disliked a lot. So I won't be continuing on into the rest of the books set in this world. The fifth prompt was to read a book where the characters experience dreams. These can be magical and mystical or completely mundane. And for this one, I read Winter's Heart by Robert Jordan. This one is the 9th book in the Wheel of Time series. I'm currently part of a Wheel of Time read along. We are almost done. There's just 2 books to go, guys. But this is a classic fantasy series, an epic fantasy series following the eternal struggle between light and dark. In every age, the same kind of events happen over and over again, and there are a handful of people who are able to alter the pattern of these events and change things for the better or the worse. And in this series, we are following this age's dragon reborn as he tries to turn the world towards light, but very much has dark impulses as well. In this world, there is a dream world called Telan Riod, which a couple of the main characters can access as like part of the magical abilities that they have. But there are also other types of dreams in here. There's wolf dreams. I think one of the characters also has not prophetic dreams, but like the opposite of prophetic dreams, almost like the elements of a past life kind of resurfacing. So dreams are definitely 100% a central element in the Wheel of Time series. The 6th prompt was entitled Animals, or a book that has an animal in the title. So the original book that I had in for this one was Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, which is a book I think that was on my 2024 TBR that I just never got to. And instead I used The Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli for this one. This is a fantasy romance between a witch and a witch hunter, where the witch has dedicated her life since the downfall of witches to releasing witches from custody before they can be executed, and she is searching for somebody who just before she finds them is captured by the witch hunters. So she then aims to get closer to the captain of the witch hunters to find the valuable information that she needs about where this witch is being held so that she can free her. And the witch hunters are looking for this vigilante figure that goes by the Crimson Moth, and Gideon, the leader, is tipped off that it may be the main character Rune who is masquerading as this Crimson Moth figure, so he kind of goes along with it, also also trying to get closer to her to figure out if she is the criminal that they are searching for. So glad that I read this one. Can't speak on Starling House, obviously, because I didn't get to it, but I'm definitely glad that I read this one because it turned out to be one of my favorite books of the year. The 7th prompt was one of the more difficult ones for me that took me a little bit longer to fulfill, and that is bards. So for this one, you had to read a book in which the primary protagonist is a bard, musician, a poet, or a storyteller. I know quite a few books that would fulfill this prompt, but none of those ones are ones that I read. On my TBR, I had A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, where I knew one of the main characters, I think, was a bard, but the book that I actually ended up reading was Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. So this series has a very unique, to me at least, storytelling structure. It's one that really sticks in my mind because all of the books in this series are told in different perspectives, but they're also told from the perspective of a narrator that is putting together a document of the events of this series to present to somebody. So in the first book, we are following a boy called Kieran who has the power to make or break the world, although at that stage even he doesn't know which way he's gonna go, and we don't either. And he is imprisoned with a monster called Talon. So the monster asks him to tell her a story, so he agrees, and the place where he starts telling his story is where he deems his life to have become interesting. But after that first chapter, Talon stops him and says, no, your story started much earlier than that, and she takes it back further in time and fills in the early years of his life. Throughout the course of the first book, those perspectives alter until the timelines catch up to each other and join in present day. By the time we get to book 3, the storytelling is a little bit different because the entirety of book 3 does take place in the present timeline, but it is all told by a narrator who is also a part of the story. And at the beginning, you have a foreword, which is a letter to the person that the documents are being assembled for, and also like a kind of summary of the documents up to this part so far. So it has like a third perspective narrator that is assembling and telling the story to a different party who is also a part of the story. And then you also have Kieran in here who forms part of the storytelling because he's narrating his story from his own perspective while other people are narrating other parts of it in third person. It's a very convoluted way to fulfill the prompt, but ultimately I decided that this was good enough to work. The 8th prompt was prologues and epilogues, which was pretty simple. It was just to read a book that had a prologue or an epilogue, and the hard mode was to read a book that had both. I can't remember at this point if this book had both, but a lot of the books that I read do, and that was Glow by Raven Kennedy, which is the 4th book in the Plated Prisoner series. This is not actually the book that I intended to read for this prompt though. I wanted to read Harold the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, which was a sequel to a book that I really enjoyed that I wanted to get to, and sadly I did not make it. But Glow was also a sequel in a series that I really enjoy, so swings and roundabouts. If you guys are unfamiliar with the Plated Prisoner series, it is a romantasy King Midas retelling where we're following a girl called Auron who is King Midas's prized possession. She has been gold touched and she is entirely gold, like everything about her body is gold, and he keeps her in a cage in his palace. However, she does not mind being his gilded prisoner because it offers her a level of protection that she does not feel she can get in the outside world and that she very much desires because of terrible things that have been done to her in the past. So this story changes a little bit when Midas has decided that he wants to conquer a neighboring territory, and so he starts to move his favorite people and his favorite things to this new territory, and the caravan that Auron is traveling in is besieged by bandits, and she kind of has to step into herself and stand on her own 2 feet for the first time in a long time. I did really like this one. It had quite a slow pace and it focused a lot on trauma and recovery, but I loved the ending and I really need to get to book 5 in this series. This is really funny actually because there's a clarification that I actually need in the next prompt, because prompt number 9 is a book that has been self-published or published by an indie publisher, and the clarification is that if it was a book that has been self-published and has since been picked up by a traditional publisher, then you had to have read it while it was self-published. And the book that I had on my TBR and the book that I read to fulfill this prompt was Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent, which was one of the books for my Patreon book club throughout the year. And this has actually just been picked up by a publisher. I don't think it's actually been traditionally published yet, but it is coming. And I did indeed read this at some point last year when it was still a self-published book. But this one is a fantasy romance series following a girl who is a slave. She frees herself from slavery, but she has to leave her best friend behind. So she goes to this very powerful order of magicians and asks them to help her topple the slave empire where she's come from. And they tell her that they can only assist people who are members of their order. So she has to join this magic school to hone her powers so that when she has finished this apprenticeship, she will hopefully be able to win their aid in freeing her best friend and the rest of the people from the country that she's from, only to figure out that maybe this order of magic wielders, while they have the power to be benevolent, maybe they are not as benevolent as they appear. This is a series that I really enjoyed. I did expect to enjoy it a little bit more than I did, and I think the first book was maybe my favorite in the series, but it's definitely a romantasy series that like I enjoyed consistently all the way through. Prompt number 10 was romantasy, which is simple. It is a fantasy romance or a romantasy book. And for this one, I mean, a lot of these were romantasy anyway, but for this one, I read A Game of Fate by Scarlett St. Clair, which is the second book in the Hades and Persephone saga. This one is a contemporary fantasy, so it takes place in a modern world where the Greek gods kind of never disappeared and they're a part of this world. They control the world, but the world has kind of modernized the same way that it would have. And Hades runs a gambling empire where Persephone goes, and she doesn't realize she's talking to Hades, but he offers to teach her how to play poker. And when she loses, he tells her that she is now indebted to him, and to be able to earn her freedom back, she has to make life in the underworld or she's going to have to stay there forever. So the first book is from Persephone's perspective, the second book is from Hades, and they alternate like that. So I read this one because I was going to an event where I would be meeting Scarlett St. Clair, and this is where I was up to in the series. It's a very enjoyable series. It is one that I like a lot. It's not one of my favorites, but it's a very like compelling, quick series. Prompt number 11 was dark academia, so to read a book that fits the dark academia aesthetic. And the hard mode for this is that the school in itself is completely mundane, so it's not like a magical school or an assassin school or anything like that. And I think I fulfilled the hard mode of this prompt. So the book that was on my TBR was actually The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake, another series I very much would like to continue on with, but I have not. But the book that I actually read was Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is set at Oxford University. There is a magic system that ties into the university, but obviously Oxford University itself completely mundane. So this is the story of a boy called Robin who was taken by a rich English gentleman from the Canton region of China and raised amongst English society. He was trained to join the translation school of Oxford because he can provide a valuable service to the British Empire because he is fluent in Mandarin as well as English, and the magic system in here relies on translation and especially requires people who have a like innate knowledge of a language for the most effective translations. It's a story that focuses mainly on colonialism, cultural appropriation, racism, especially within prestigious institutions like Oxford, and also the way that racism and systemic racism prevails even today. And we also have a compelling plotline in here as well, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So this is one that I actually thought that I would really dislike, and I ended up really loving it, so I'm glad that I read this one. Number 12 was a pretty easy one, and that is a multi-POV book, so a book with at least 3 points of view. The hard mode is a book with at least 5, and I cannot remember for sure, but I feel like this counts. We have the Sabine, there's Leo, there's Brock, not Brock, Broad. There's, who else is the other one? There's the Prince. I can count at least 4 in here. I'm not sure if we have 5, but it's A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. This is one that I did have in my TBR, but for a different prompt. The original one I had in for this prompt was Refree the Stars by Hafsa Faisal, but actually looking at this now, it specifies at least 3 point of view characters, and that one only has 2. So I'm glad that I swapped it out for A Little Hatred instead. This is the first book in the Age of Madness trilogy, which is the last trilogy set in Joe Abercrombie's First Law world, and it's very difficult to explain the plot of this one because it's very much made up of the parts of all of the books that came before it, but it is essentially set in a world that is on the brink of massive social upheaval and a worker revolution. We are on the brink of the industrial age as well, and we are following characters in here that are, the majority of them are in a position of privilege, and they are facing the world as they know it and their way of life massively destabilizing. I really enjoyed this one. It's my favorite series in in the First Law world and was also one of my favourite books of last year as well. Prompt number 13 was a book published in 2024. I had Empire of the Damned in by J. Kristoff for this. Another sequel that I very much wanted to read, and I have not. But the book that I went with instead was A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen. I was very excited about this one because I have read from Danielle L. Jensen before. I have read the Bridge Kingdom series, the first 2 books, and really enjoyed them. So I was excited for this one, but it just really didn't do it for me, unfortunately. It is heavily inspired by Norse mythology. I actually do not remember very much about what this one was. I know that it is a young girl who is in a abusive, loveless marriage. Her husband tries to kill her and she summons this like magic shield, which ends up drawing the attention of, I think it would be the Jarl of the area, that takes her with him because she's part of some like great prophecy that I think whoever she's with is going to become like the king of the area and unite like all of the earldoms. So she's taken with him and she starts to grow closer to his son, who is one of his chief warriors. I think that if you like romantasy that has a good balance of romance and fantasy, then this would be something that you enjoy, but for some reason it just didn't really click with me and I never really got that invested. Prompt number 14 was a book with a character that has a physical or mental disability, and the hard mode is that it's a main character that has the disability. And for this one I have one of the books in the Die series, which is a comic series. I think that it's book 2, volume 2 is the one that I've used to fulfill the prompt, but the one that I had in originally was The Ending Fire by Sarah El-Arifi, which I did use to fulfill a different prompt. But this one is a comic book series that is based off D&D, where for one of the characters' birthday parties when they're a teenager, one of them has created a role-playing game and he gives them all a dice, and when they roll the dice they're transported to this fantasy world. So they go missing from the real world for multiple years and just reappear one day, but there's only 5 of them that come back, not 6. And many years later, when they're in their 30s, they end up coming together again when one of them is mailed a dice, and they once again end up sucked into this world where they are aiming to right the wrongs that they left behind like 20 years ago. One of the characters in here, when she went into this fantasy world, she lost an arm because of the particular manifestation of her character in this role-playing game, and when she returned, that like never resolved and she ended up living the rest of her life with one arm. So prompt number 15 is the one that I did not fulfill, and that was to read a book that was published in the 90s. I was very mad about this one because I've read so many books in the Wheel of Time series. Before this challenge started, I'd read 8, and the first book that I read, the next book that we were reading in the Wheel of Time series when this challenge had started, was the book that was published in the year 2000. So I was so close, but I actually thought that I would have to just give this one up because I didn't get to it. I only read one book that was published before the year 2000 last year, which was a literary fiction. And then I remembered that you can swap a prompt out, so I actually swapped this one for the equivalent prompt on the 2023 board, which was to read a book that was published in the 2000s. The original book that I had in for this prompt, by the way, if I had have gone with the 90s, was Daughter of the Blood by Anne Bishop, which I still very much want to read but just didn't get to. And then when I swapped the prompt out for the 2000s, I ended up using Fantasy Lover by Sherilyn Kenyon to fulfill this one, which was published in 2003. This is the first book in a paranormal romance series that focuses on Greek gods, and a woman accidentally summons like an ancient Greek sex slave out of a book and has to try and figure out how to free him. I'm not a big fan of paranormal romance, especially ones like this that have very thin, like 300-ish page books, focusing more on romance than they do on plot, and then follow a different couple per book. So I ended up deciding not to continue the series after this, but in terms of paranormal romance, it's probably one of the better ones that I've read. I just still didn't enjoy it very much. For the 4th row, prompt number 16 is Orcs, Trolls and Goblins Oh My, and this is to read a book with an orc, a troll or a goblin as a character. Now I originally had Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry in for this one, which I feel like is the obvious choice. Still have not read that book though, so the one that I went with, this was a difficult one, was Nectar of the Wicked by Ella Fields. This one has a troll who is the main character's best friend. I'm just going to check that he's a troll. He's a goblin. I feel like I could have fulfilled this prompt earlier in the year, but I feel like in the types of fantasy books that I read, at least, I either read like fantasy romance, which doesn't tend to have like a lot of orcs, trolls, and goblins, or I read more like military-based fantasy, things like the First Law series, Game of Thrones, like things that don't really have many fantastical creatures. So that's why this one was such a struggle for me. But this one is a romantasy following a girl who has been raised in the lands between the human and the Fey worlds. She is a changeling, and her guardian has been waiting for her to come of age so that she can take her to the wild hunt market and trade her back in exchange for her own human daughter. And when she does that, she ends up being killed, and the main character is not mad about it because her guardian was horrible. And left with no way to pay the rent or make her way in this world, she ends up joining the pleasure house that her guardian worked for, where she meets a fairy king who, in exchange for her marrying him, offers to help her find out who her true family are. Didn't end up enjoying this one too much. You'll be hearing about it soon, actually, because this was a recent read. There were things that I liked about it and things that I didn't, but I'm glad that I read it because otherwise I would have been really stuck for this prompt. Prompt number 17 was to read a space opera. This one is a little bit more of a literary sci-fi than I typically read, especially when we're talking about space operas. I feel like the majority of the space operas I've read have been more fun and fast-paced as opposed to like slow and thought-provoking like this one. But this is the one that was on my TBR and the one I read for the prompt, which is The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This one is a multi-perspective story following 3 individuals at different points in time. There is a woman who invented a series of space stations that helped to save humanity when planet Earth was collapsing. There is a boy who falls and lands on a planet that provides a valuable resource to this like intergalactic conglomeration that is controlling most of space. And there is the pilot who agrees to take this boy back into space with her to try and figure out where he came from, and she's tasked with protecting him to see if he has this specific ability that people think that he does that will help to advance the human race in space and like enhance their capabilities. This is one that was a 5-star prediction for me. It didn't quite get 5 stars. I think it just skewed a little bit too literary, a little bit too slow for me, especially for the length of it and the perspectives. The thing that I love the most about sci-fi is the science element of it. So the bits that I really like to focus on, which this was more about like social interaction and connections between people. But I definitely enjoyed this and would read from Simon Jimenez again. Prompt number 18 was an author of color. So for this one, I read The Ending Fire by Sarah El-Arifi, which is the one that I previously had in for a different prompt. I think it was Character with a Disability I had this one in for originally. This one is the final book in the Ending Fire trilogy by Sarah El-Arifi, which is a adult fantasy series that is set in a world where people are separated by the colors of their bloods, and there was a rebellion where red-blooded and blue-blooded children were swapped. So red bloods are the nobility and blue bloods are the underclass, and then you also have like a servant slave class, which are translucent blooded people, and the rebellion swapped them so that they could raise these red-blooded children in blue-blooded homes so that they could see the oppression faced by those of different blood colors, and eventually they were going to submit them into the series of trials amongst the red-blooded people that picks the next leaders of the world. So we're following a character from each blood color in here that were part of this rebellion, or they were the children that were swapped in this rebellion that have ended up kind of in the wrong place in the world and also at a loose end. I sadly did not love this one. I definitely think it was a disappointing conclusion to this trilogy, but I really like Sarah El-Arifi and I love the first 2 books in this series, which is why it was especially disappointing, but I enjoyed the rest of this series. It's just parts of this one weren't great in my opinion. Prompt number 19 is to read a book in which the primary goal of the characters and story focuses on survival. The book that I actually had in for this one was The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson, which no, I have still not read. But the book that I used to fulfill the prompt was The Jazad Air by Sarah Hashem. This also fulfills the hard mode on this prompt, which is essentially survival that isn't like a pandemic or a virus in any way. So not a zombie apocalypse essentially. But this one is the story of the last survivor to a kingdom that has been essentially hunted to extinction. They are the only magic wielders in the world. Everybody used to have magic magic, and there was this extra kingdom that was created to police the rest. And over the years, magic has died out in all but one kingdom because this kingdom were getting too powerful and they were using their power for not necessarily great things. This other kingdom stepped in and annihilated them and then hunted down the rest of the people from this kingdom and killed them one by one. So our main character has been on the run her entire life. She was rescued from the palace and raised by somebody who was very close to the royal family for a while, and since then she's just kind of staying in villages on the outskirts of cities to fly under the radar and try and just like live her life. But her power is discovered by the prince of this kingdom that was created to police the rest, and he takes her with him. She thinks she's going to her execution, but he has a task for her where she will eventually be able to win her freedom. So this is a story that I very much enjoyed. It is a fantasy romance, I would say, very much in the vein of things that I have read and loved, like We Hunt the Flame and also like Throne of Glass. So I had a very good time with this, and the main character's main goal in life is literally just to survive, so I felt like it fit this prompt perfectly. Prompt number 20 was to judge a book by its cover, so essentially read a book just because you like how it looks. The book that I had in on my TBR is the one that I read, which is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. I love this colour. It's a Fairy Loot edition, and I do have to say it is mainly the colour palette that I love here. I think it's stunning. This one is a gothic story that is following a woman who married a man, and the only condition that she had when she married him is that he would not pry into her past. But when they have to travel back to her family home, I think her aunt is dying or something like that, and her husband kind of can't help but explore the past of the woman that he loves. This was haunting. I really loved the atmosphere. It's not the best book or the most memorable book that I've ever read, but I really enjoyed the experience of reading it because I just love me a gothic story, and I really liked the kind of twists and turns in this one as well. On to the final row. Prompt number 21 was to read a book where the primary setting is a small town. I originally intended to read the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix for this, another book I still very much want to read, but I did not. And the book that I actually read was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which actually was a book that I had wanted to read for a really long time. I did achieve hard mode with this one as well, because the clarification for that is that the small town can be real or fictional, but the broader setting must be in our real world and not a secondary world. And this is set in, I think it starts in Mexico City, and then it takes it to a smaller town somewhere in that area. I can't remember exactly where, but this is following a young woman who is receiving letters from her cousin who is recently married, saying something like, I think it's that her husband is trying to kill her or something like that. So her father sends her to investigate, and she ends up going to this small town, to this like manor house on top of a hill that's really isolated, and she finds her cousin in a very unwell state, and the family members of this family that her cousin is married into are very, very creepy in many different ways. This is a gothic horror, and I enjoyed it in the gothic elements of it, because gothic books tend to have a slow build. This was also quite similar to The Last Tale of the Flower Bride in the initial setup, but the, I guess, fantastical elements that are revealed later on were very, very different. And this specifically had a horror element that I really don't like, and I would not have picked this book up if I'd have known. It's nothing like crazy, it's just something that I particularly try to avoid because it creeps me out. I don't like it, which horror's supposed to, so take from that what you will. But yeah, I ultimately didn't like it because of that particular subgenre of horror it ended up falling into. But the gothic stuff, like, I really enjoyed, and I have read from and enjoyed Silvia Moreno Garcia in the past as well. I don't have very much to say about prompt number 22 because it is to read 5 fantasy or sci-fi short stories. I hate short stories. I really do, and I'm pretty sure that this is a prompt on every board. However, I'm pretty sure I DNF'd this book, but I'm pretty sure that in October, actually no, I know it was this October gone because I've only just unhauled this book, but I tried to read the Book of Witches, which is edited by Jonathan Stroud, and it's just a anthology of short stories surrounding witches. I really just do not like short stories. I definitely read, I can't tell you how many I read in this book at this point, but I definitely read more than 5 because I read around 200 pages of this 400-page book before I realized that I just wasn't, it's not that I wasn't retaining the information, I was enjoying the stories in the moment, but then even now I couldn't tell you a single thing about a single short story that I read, which is why I just typically typically don't read them very much. And so I read enough short stories to fulfill this prompt, but ultimately I did DNF the anthology as a whole. The hard mode for this prompt is, oh no, I guess I didn't achieve it. I was like, I don't know if I did, but the hard mode says read an entire speculative anthology or collection, and I DNF, so I guess that doesn't count. Prompt number 23 was Eldritch Creatures. This was to read a book featuring a being that is uncanny, unearthly, and weird. So I was struggling a little bit to figure out what an eldritch creature was. I'm very pedantic, so I wanted to make sure it was an eldritch creature and not just one that I was assigning the term eldritch to, just because that's how my brain works. And I originally put in one of the volumes of Die for this prompt, but then I actually ended up reading Orphea by Joanne M. Harris, which I felt fit this prompt perfectly. So this one was quite a short book. It read kind of like a modern fairy tale, and it was following a woman who had lost her daughter a few years before. Like, her daughter was an adult, maybe in her early 20s, and we're following a little bit of an older protagonist. But to deal with her grief, she didn't sleep very much, and so she spent a lot of time running through London, and one day she falls into a fairy world where she thinks her daughter may be trapped. So the fairies in this world were your very typical folkloric, tied to nature, creepy tricksters are trying to trap you, maybe might eat humans, and I just felt like they definitely fit the Eldritch prompt perfectly. Prompt 24 was Reference Materials, which is a book that features something like a map, a glossary, a dramatis personae. The book that I ended up reading for this is the one that was on my TBR, but I remember being surprised that this did contain reference materials because I wasn't expecting it. This one has a dramatis personae in the back, and it is Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness, which is the second book in the Discovery of Witches series. So this one is kind of like a paranormal romance series that has a lot of historical fiction elements, following a woman who works at Oxford called Diana, who is a witch. She doesn't have very strong magical abilities though, and she isn't really in touch with that side of herself, but when she accidentally summons a lost manuscript from the Bodleian Library that pertains to the creation of the magical creatures of the world, so the witches, the vampires, and the demons, people start to congregate, or should I say, demons, vampires, and witches start to congregate around her to try and get this manuscript from her. One of these people is a scientist and an ancient powerful vampire called Matthew, who has been doing some research in the declining power within the vampires and the magical community, and he would like this manuscript to further his research, and he ends up growing close to Diana and protecting her from everybody else who is willing to go the extra mile to get this manuscript from her. So this was not my favorite book in the series. This is where the historical fiction elements really come in, and I felt like it was a little bit slow and drawn out, and we were more exploring this location and this time period than we were pursuing the plot with any haste. That, I think, is because Deborah Harkness is a historian. That is her background, so I feel like this book was very indulgent for her, so I understand, but for me it was a little bit too drawn out. And then the final prompt for the 2024 bingo board was to read a book club or a read-along book. So there are a bunch of different read-alongs and book clubs that are associated with our fantasy, and for this one you just had to read any of their past or present picks, so any book that they've read for any book club or read-along throughout the history of the book clubs and the read-alongs, and there's a spreadsheet for each one. So essentially every time I read a fantasy book I looked to see if it had been picked for one of their book clubs, and finally I found one, which was The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. This one is a fantasy romance, but it's more in the style of a romantic comedy on a fun fantasy backdrop, because this one is a retelling of You've Got Mail, where we're following an undertaker called Mercy and a marshal called Hart. These two absolutely despise each other. However, in a moment of loneliness, Hart writes a letter which finds its way to Mercy, and they start corresponding anonymously, and over time also break down the friction between them to maybe develop a bit of a friendship. I really liked this one. It's not one where the world building is something that you really should be paying attention to. There's very confusing things in this world, things that don't quite make sense if you look into them too hard, which I look into everything super hard. So I kind of just had to eventually roll with it. And like I said, this is more of a rom-com on a fun fantasy background, so I'd recommend this for people who like romance, like contemporary romantic comedies that want like a little bit of a shake up on the genre with a fantasy plot and a fantasy backdrop in there. So those are all of the books that I read for for the 2024 R Fantasy Bingo card, I am going to be participating in the 2025 challenge as well. Unfortunately, you will have to wait just a little bit for my TBR because the new prompts are going to drop just a little bit too close to when I go away for a couple of weeks. So I'm only going to be able to make that video when I'm back at the end of April, and I'm pretty sure I have it in my calendar to be published towards the beginning of May. So do keep an eye out for that if you are interested to see what I'll be reading for this challenge in 2025. I don't know if I want to do hard mode next time around because I did find this easy. There is only one that I didn't organically fill throughout my year of reading. I didn't have to specifically read a book for any of these prompts. It would have been great if I'd have actually managed to fill this without swapping out a prompt, because truly the only book that I had to try and read was that one that was published in the 90s, and I failed. So I guess I'll see what hard mode is, because some of them are very, very specific and I don't want to pin myself in so tightly. But then this one wasn't specifically challenging for me as somebody who reads a lot of fantasy. But down in my comments, let me know if you participated in the R Fantasy Bingo card this year and how did you do, because I think at the time I'm posting this, there's only about a week for you guys to wrap up those bingo cards. So let me know how you're getting on, and if you guys would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a flower emoji in the comments for the last tale of the flower bride. But aside from that, guys, I do hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, please don't forget to like if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram and my Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.